Patrick Cook here. So welcome to session number 13. That's our lucky session of the Mandelbulb3D Epic Rendering tutorial series. So what I want to do here now is I want to move this. This tutorial. I want to move it forward and get you into the details. Now, so far, in the previous 12 sessions, we talked about the whole idea of why we would go about having large, high-resolution renders. We talked about the limitations, the memory limitations that we have to deal with. We talked about a good solution to doing a native rendering of a Mandelbulb image by using tiling. So, and we did a little example of tiling. We did 16 tiles of 4 by 4, and then we used a free application that does a really good job called ImageJ with a plugin that merges those tiles together without relying upon overlapping tiles and without suffering the whole panoramic stitching thing where it's trying to correct parallax issues and that sort of thing. We don't need that kind of complexity. So that brings us to here. Now I had mentioned a couple different use cases for why we might go about having a high resolution graphic. And I want to just review those here again because it's important to know where you're going with your project to determine whether or not a high resolution image is the way you want to go. Now, certainly, if you're going for a low resolution situation, you don't need to get into high resolution. You don't need tens of thousands of pixels wide and deep and stuff. If you're just displaying it on a monitor, or if you're sharing it with people on the internet, you certainly don't need high resolution. And you can do everything well within the capabilities of the main render. All right, the main render, this is where it would render when you hit the Calculate 3D. All right, the main renderer, as we have seen, will get you 9,000 pixels by 6,000 fairly comfortably, keeping in mind that my system is an i9 with plenty of memory, plenty of hard drive space. So my situation may be different than yours. You may run into limitations earlier if you're using a low-end PC or if you're maybe a laptop or something. But anyway, so if you're just doing a standard rendering, you can use the main rendering. It does a good job. There's some things that it won't do for you, all right, that the big render, the tiling process will do for you, but then there's other things that it will do for you that the big render won't do. Anyway, it's important to have in mind what you're trying to do before you decide just whether or not you need a big render. So when you don't need a big render or a high resolution render, you're simply displaying it up on the internet. You're relying upon the monitor, the LCD monitor, to upscale it for you, okay? Or if you prefer to use an upscaling software application, you can certainly take a 9,000 by 6,000 native Mandelbulb image, and you can run that through an upscaling software. It'll do a good job. All right, but those aren't native pixels anymore. Those are interpolated. There's pixels that are added in between other pixels. So you're kind of faking a higher resolution. You're upscaling it. Okay, but that's okay. If that's all you need, then you don't need to go for a high resolution output. Now, if you're doing an animation, you don't need a high resolution output. As a matter of fact, you want to stay away from that because it takes time to render each of those frames. And if you're doing an animation and let's say you have 5,000 frames, that might give you a 20-second animation at, say, 60 frames per second. All right. You don't need a 9,000 by 6,000 frame for each of the frames that go into your animation. It's just too much. It's not necessary. A lot of that, even if you did do that, a lot of that detail information tends to get lost as the animation plays out. All right, the human mind just can't capture it all. Now, certainly if you wanted to go and do a 4K or an 8K type of an animation, you're going to need high resolution images that become frames. And you're going to be into a lot of rendering. It may not be the way to go. If you wanted to, say, an 8K animation, okay, assuming that your PC equipment can handle that, all right, that's a pretty heavy load. You probably need a really beefy GPU, and you probably need an i9 or higher. You need really robust hardware and software to be able to work with an 8K. However, you can do that. You could output enough frames at 8K resolution, all right, from the Mandelbulb software using the tiling. A very labor-intensive approach, but you can. Now, in that case, when you're trying to do an 8K or even a 4K animation, in that case, you would be better off rendering at a resolution from Mandelbulb that does not require tiling, because you're just adding a lot of work. Use the main rendering and render up to the allocation of memory that the Mandelbulb application can get. We know that's 9,000 by 6,000 here on my machine. And then upscale your frames, or build the animation at a lower resolution, output it to, I don't know, an MP4 or something like that, or an MOV, and then upscale that. If you retain the quality at the lower resolution, you should be able to upscale it with good software. You should be able to upscale it to 4K, possibly even 8K, before you start seeing serious degradation of the quality of the video. So what I'm trying to say here is that you don't normally use this Mandelbulb tiling, this big render capability, to create animation frames. There are other ways to do it, all right? But so just to kind of end this session, we'll pick it up again in the next session. You normally are not going to want to do a big render when you're dealing with animation and when you don't need a big render, all right? let's leave it at that at the end of this session. In the next session, I want to talk about when you would want to use the Big Render capabilities of the Mandelbulb3D software, okay? When you do want to use it. We just talked about when you don't really need to or want to. Let's come back in the next session and we'll talk about when you would want to use the Big Render capabilities of Mandelbulb, okay? All right, so enough for now. I'll see you in the next session. I'll see you there and we'll continue this.